And now, the moment you've all been waiting for.
Hey everybody, I'm here with Celeste Parr. This is Shaun reporting for Is It a Bicycle? Celeste Parr is the author, the writer of the movie Gurov and Anna. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to get right into it because we all had a big discussion about this movie just recently in our last episode. And so it revolves around a college professor and one of his students and their love affair, in part inspired by their shared fixation on an Anton Chekhov short story, which gives the movie its title. So, my first question is, when did you first come across the story, and were you, like the characters, somehow gripped by it?
I had heard about the story many times. I studied literature as an undergrad student and then again in graduate school at McGill. Didn't actually read it until I was in second or third year of my undergrad at Concordia University. And actually, I wasn't gripped at all by it when I first read it. But I'd met so many people at that point who had been gripped by it. And I thought I was interested in what gripped them and became more interested in the way people sort of attach to certain stories that speak to them. I was more interested in that than I was in the story itself. And it seemed like a perfect story to examine this way that we attach, because to me, in every other way, the story is actually pretty unremarkable. But it has a really profound effect on these people's lives.
Okay, that's interesting, and we definitely see that effect on the main characters in your film. I guess my next question then is, how much of the short story, and we get to hear bits of it throughout, how much of it should we transpose onto the way we take in the film and the characters and the relationships? For example, we were remarking about how one of the lines and one of the discussions between the characters talks about how Gurov may just hate women. Are we supposed to prescribe that to the main character of Benjamin?
Well, I think part of the thematic thrust of the film is actually how inappropriate the projection of the story is onto this relationship. It's almost arbitrary. It's kind of a matter of, the perfect, a bunch of elements coming together to create the perfect storm. Both of them at a particular moment in their lives, because Mercedes is really nothing at all like Anna, but I guess partly because of her youth, partly because of the way that she feels around Benjamin, and part of her just her method in her relationships is she doesn't say very much. She's not very forthcoming with her feelings. A lot of what she does and says is in need of interpretation, and that makes her kind of an ideal person to project a whole other character onto, which Benjamin does with Anna. He even calls her his Anna at one point, but she's actually nothing at all like Anna.
That's interesting, because what I'm being reminded of, the way that you're talking about it, is when inevitably, sometime right before or during college, a bunch of young boys usually read On the Road and then suddenly use that to justify their behaviors, no matter how boorish or lazy they might be. Okay, I get it. I see it.
We all have a way of romanticizing ourselves and our lives through different cultural artifacts that we've consumed.
And it's interesting that in essence, you've now made a cultural artifact. Like, what happens if there's a literature professor who watches this movie and goes, you know what, maybe I shouldn't do kisses with any of my students. That might be what has happened.
Well, that would be interesting. I mean, part of what the movie is about is that we're not really supposed to use literature or fiction that way. I don't think that's my personal relationship to art, is I'm not supposed to use it. It's not a morality play. It's not supposed to be didactic. It's not supposed to dictate what is or isn't appropriate in relationships. It's more about psychology and authorship and power and not the specifics of, professors shouldn't sleep with their students, which in most cases they probably shouldn't, but it's not really about that. Because certainly there's definitely enough novels and movies out there about the troubles of professors who sleep with their students.
Indeed, which is interesting because you described Chekhov's short story as unremarkable except for X, Y, and Z. And there's even a line in the movie where someone mentions how cliche it is for a professor to sleep with their students. So it's interesting that you see that in your text and you're trying to inject more stuff into it.
Yeah, I do it twice actually. Like there's that later reference to how cliche that is for, a professor in his middle age especially. But very early on in the story, when they're talking about the Chekhov story in Benjamin's class, one of the students says, well, he cheated on his wife. And Benjamin says, congratulations, you read the synopsis. And that's my early signal to people to try and read beyond that. It's about the cliche more than it is. It's about why the cliche happens, how we do this to ourselves, how do we make ourselves cliches.
Okay. And you also mentioned power, and there's certainly a vast and intimate power dynamic happening in a lot of the scenes in this movie, often in a kind of master and a slave way. Can I ask, you were obviously conscious of that when writing, but how did you go about it? Like in a screenplay, did it get down to the minutiae of like who moves where and when, or how did you try and convey that power exchange?
The physicality of it really was Raphael's territory, because there were scenes that I wrote a certain way, the way that the logistically, and physically in the scene, how the characters relate to one another, and just given the set that we were working with and the light and a number of factors, Raphael chose to stage it a different way. All the time, though, really, I think heightening the meaning of what I was trying to say anyway. But for me, it really was about, I guess, most of it was a matter of who is revealing themselves more in this scene, and a lot of the time it's Benjamin. He says he just lets it all out. He let that beast out for a high-spirited run. Meanwhile, Mercedes really keeps to herself. And there's the language issue too. I mean, this is built into their relationship. As long as Mercedes is speaking to him in English, even though there's this idea of power when you're speaking the first language of somebody else, at the same time, as long as Mercedes is speaking English to Benjamin, she can only realistically portray a fraction of who she is, because it's not her first language. And in not being fully exposed, she gets to retain some power.
And that's great, because I know all the other podcasters are going to be very happy you talked about the language in it, because one of us, Mike, I believe, saw it a different way, as the power dynamic of Benjamin going, no, we're going to speak English. Because when he does actually speak French in the film, it happens very little and only at quite vulnerable times. But that's really interesting. So just to get back to maybe the physicality that you mentioned, there are a number of sex scenes in this that manage to be like unique in their own and really pretty, and often not just graphic but mean. The jargon that we came up with was hate sex. So I guess it's kind of a similar question. Was that you? Was that Raphael? Like, and how do you write that down? Was it just a lot of, and then they do kisses?
I don't think I ever phrased it quite like that, but I definitely would describe, I guess, degrees to which these two were making out, or in some cases in which, one was trying to make out and the other one wasn't, or But definitely on the page, there was always a clear indication who was um, who was receiving or who was in control,
Mhm.
and sometimes that wasn't exactly necessarily hate sex so much as it was um, establishing a boundary that wasn't previously there, and then other times it's about completely destroying a boundary. So, but it was always on the page for sure,
Mhm.
the degree to which these things occurred.
Okay. And my next question then is, as screenwriters, we're warned often, don't make your characters writers.
Hmm.
And I've heard it many times for loads of different reasons, whether it's because, well, then what do they do? Do they go write stuff and we can listen to their voiceover?
Hmm.
But what I think is the benefit of having your characters be writers in this, they can say things that coming out of the mouths of most people would make them sound just really unlikable and
Yeah.
foppish and terrible. But here they can say, and perhaps it's a European element as well, or not a European element, but a multilingual element. They can say things and have them be, in fact, literary, and go, well, of course, because that person's trying to write a book, or that person's writing short stories all the time, or
Hmm.
whatever. Did you take advantage of that, or were you conscious of it, or was that just something that you could let happen?
I had to be very conscious of it because in earlier drafts, it was really over the top, actually.
Mm-hmm.
The literariness of Benjamin's dialogue in particular
Mm-hmm.
was never really a problem with Mercedes because I was always conscious of her um, speaking her second language, and also having stated very early in the film that when she does write in English, it takes her a lot longer. And so if it takes her that long to write true in English, then how can she be totally true when she's speaking it? Which is, you're on the spot. You have to come out with something. You can't sit there and agonize over what you're saying. I mean, you could, but you'd probably be pretty tedious to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
And then Benjamin, in previous drafts, was very tedious to talk to because he was so, um, yeah, like really heavy-handed literary. And now over certain drafts, with the help of Raphael and with my producers and my story consultant, really sort of toned down his literariness to certain moments, and certain emotional states that he gets into. Also, an element of power there too, because when he does speak that way, he's kind of exerting his authority a little bit, um, because he's like almost trying to manipulate Mercedes by teaching her. In this moment, he's the older, wiser person, and he's going to tell her that it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Even when to her it really feels not okay.
And speaking of edits and story, what was it?
Story consultant.
Story consultant. Were there things that you had that you thought would always make it into the final cut of the film, or were there any big changes from inception or conception to now?
There were major changes, but the heart of it always stayed the same, and thematically it stayed the same. And there was never anything that I cut that I felt like I was losing. It always felt like, oh yeah, that's great. That's so much better. Even after we filmed, when we were in editing, there were cuts that sometimes it was me watching it and saying, oh, yeah, I don't think I should have written that like that. Can we get rid of it? Or just tightening things up. But yeah, I mean, I've been working on this for so long. It was my master's thesis in grad school, and so naturally over the 4 or 5 years since then, just with the way that we were approaching it, culturally and thematically, there were all kinds of changes, and then obviously budget considerations and the like.
Mm-hmm.
But it always, in my opinion, felt
Mm-hmm.
improved.
But you had to leave out like any evil twins or earthquakes, massive fireballs, explosions. Leave that stuff
No.
out. Doesn't quite make sense. I
No.
get you.
Although there was one thing, and I don't want to spoil anything, but there is one very important beat in like the climax of the film that the night that we were filming it, I just happened to be there on set that night. I was only around for a few weeks, and Raphael had hesitations about it, and I really just was. I'm not, I'm pretty easygoing about changes, and I was absolutely firm. This can't change. This absolutely has to be there. And phone calls from my producer going, "Are you sure about this?" And I was like, yes. Like otherwise, I'll be devastated. So
Okay.
they didn't devastate me finally. So.
Okay. Well, now I'm gonna have to go back and rewatch the ending so that I can make sure I can go, oh, okay, that's the thing. Got it. A great job that you've done in this is that for every character pretty much in this, you can see that they do in fact have a life before the events of the film. And you can imagine them having lives after it as well. Like you can see into what must have happened for them and imagine their interior lives.
Mm-hmm.
Was that something that you were conscious of, perhaps particularly with Mercedes and the relationship that she was in before Benjamin?
Yeah, there was a lot of talk at the story table about trying, because in previous drafts, Mercedes was so opaque that you really couldn't get a sense of where she was coming from and where she was going. And so partly with this character of her ex-boyfriend and her current friend, and also just with this early scene in which she talks about a dream she had, I try and really lay the foundation, without too much exposition about what actually she has lived through. I try to reveal her emotional and psychological landscape by showing her in this very intimate scene in the bath and talking about something very very personal, encrypted, but very personal.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely with her, I had to take extra care. And there were other spots where I left it very late to give characters, a life. And one of those characters was Benjamin's friend John.
We all love John.
Yeah, I love him too. But actually, it was partly the actor who was playing John who was like, I need some more here. And so as they were already shooting with him, and I rewrote a couple of scenes for him to give him, a more human feeling.
That's
like a real person.
Cool. Yeah, no, we definitely think that it worked out that way. So overall, you're happy with the journey from finishing up college, master's thesis, edit. 5 years later, you've got Gurov and Anna.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. I'm really glad that it wasn't, answer to my question wasn't, yeah, no, they changed everything. I hate it.
You hear that a lot, definitely. Writers are often saddened by what happens to their babies, when they're shooting them. But certainly for me, number one, I'm not that romantic about my relationship to my own writing. I really believe in the collaborative process. So when I handed it over to Raph, I was really happy to let him do what he was going to do, and everybody that he chose to shoot it and score it and act it. I mean, I'm delighted with all the choices that he made. He just had such impeccable taste across the board, I think.
Mm-hmm. And can I ask whether for this or for other things, do you pull stuff directly from your own life in terms of events or characters?
Certainly there's always something from my life. But I always try and create an enormous amount of distance because I'm not very interesting. So nobody's going to be interested in watching anything that's about me. If I do write about my life or about, something that I've lived in proximity to, I always try and figure out what it's about before I start writing it. And once I figure out what it's about or what I think it should be about, then I, sort of completely bulldoze, the facts of it and make a story out of it, to all try and speak to a theme or an idea, usually a preoccupation of mine.
Okay, cool. Like with the Chekhov story, or at least people's reaction to it.
Yeah.
So what next? Are we gonna have to wait 5 more years before like another script, or what are you working on right now?
I'm working on many, many things. Gurov and Anna it was my first feature film to go through the pipeline, but all my other work is most of it's on commission. All of it I think is really interesting. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't be doing it. Not interesting because I'm writing it, but I wouldn't be writing it if I didn't find it interesting. But mostly genre stuff, political thriller, supernatural thriller, some romantic comedy. Like, it's really taken a turn for the more mainstream, less, indie, cerebral, master's thesis type stuff.
Okay.
But I'm really excited about all of it. It probably will be maybe a year or two before the next one's out.
Oh wow, that's actually not that far away when you
Oh,
think about it.
yeah.
We're gonna have to go back and talk to you about all of these things as they happen, and it'll be really interesting because then we can go back to this interview, and then the next time we talk, maybe you'll be like, no, they were terrible. I hate the studios. I know best. I don't know what they're doing. Um,
They'll be I'll have certainly a little um, wink in almost all of them. I tend to refer to craft dinner in almost everything I write. So,
You just blew our minds because I didn't even know that was like a thing that was popular in specific regions. And if you listen to the episode where we review Gurov and Anna, Shona,
yeah, I listened. Yeah,
and she talked about craft, yeah, a lot. So good. She'll be very
she'll
pleased to
be
hear
happy.
that.
She'll know. Anytime she sees anything with a craft dinner reference, she'll have to watch the credits after to see if I wrote it.
Well, that's perfect. That's a good way. You should get sponsorship. I'm going to make a phone call. We're going to figure this out. Well, Celeste, thank you very, very much for talking to us about this. I think it was very interesting just to hear from a writer who enjoyed the process after having watched their work. So thank you very much.
Thank you.